Hey guys, so I will try my hand on public finance today. In public finance, particularly India journey of India from independence in public finance. So after independence, India was India was having a crunch of investable capital. There were private banks and they have less money, and government doesn't have much of the uh, credibility to borrow from outside. So internal borrowing and external borrowing both were not feasible at that time. So according to that, the annual financial statements of India reflected those, like how India uh, they constrain their expenditure and make budget as stringent as possible, and so the fiscal deficit was in control around 4 or 5% till 19 let's say 60s, mid 60s. From mid 60s onwards, in 1969 India tried its hand in financial monetizing or deficit financing, like the USA has started it in 1929 after the Great Depression. So India too started its hand in deficit financing, and from that they got a taste of borrowing, and in a nutshell, expenditure spending more than they have. So India started that from that point onwards. Before that, in previously to 60s, India at one point, I think Jawaharlal Nehru ji had said that PSUs would be the modern temples of modern India. PSUs would be the modern temple of modern India. He has a great faith in PSUs, and he saw it as welfare institutions which will provide large number of jobs to middle class and unorganized, even unskilled laborers, and that they did. They set up large heavy industries with PSU as a label, and what could be said about PSU is, in my family, my father is employed in PSU, in a PSU by the name Bamal and Lari, and they did their job in providing jobs to the aspiring, or plentiful jobs they provide, but in contrast to population it was still very low, and this wasn't possible that the whole of the uh, Indian society which was moving from the agriculture could be employed in just the public sector. So they did what they could, and it was a great run until when the it was still a crunch in revenue financing, in revenue side of the budget, that they have to spend more on pension, provident funds, and all that. Once the employees started retiring, they have to pay gratuity and sorry, PF and those kind of stuffs, and then the subsequent governments started realizing the real cost of employing a huge number of population, the population which was not even required in, there is a term called disguised unemployment, meaning a workplace having more number of people than it should be, should be really there, because it increases the pressure on the balance sheet, uh, and people get employed, and the company has to bear the price, and they have to pay the cost, salary and stuff, and that's why the balance got so a private sector enterprise will try to minimize the workforce, and they will try to curtail the workforce and try to maintain minimum number of people, so that they don't have to pay a large number of money in salary and employee welfare programs. So they do that, but in government sector, the main focal point of the PSUs and the public sector is to not to create profit but to create welfare for the employees of theirs. So they did that, but again, a point came when it was believed by the officials of the PSU, the managing official, that it isn't their job to create profit. So they were lagged, they entered corruption. If you make a institution stagnant, and if the goal wouldn't be the profit making, then the real real backing of the institution will get collapsed. And so that did happen, and most of the PSUs started running in loss. Some started running in loss from the point they were established, and they continued. Some got over that and showed real promise, like ONGC and many companies which were later termed as Navaratna and Maharatnas. Except for those, meaning required, instead of giving dividends and returns to the government, they required the exchequer's money to run their day-to-day cost, and that hurts the Indian cause of welfare society for the poor and the other social goods which could have been financed by the money which was being sucked by the PSUs. So there, that is that. And then came the reform process in 1991. Basically, India's balance of payment crisis got bigger and bigger, and at one point, they have import cover of 2 weeks. They have running financial deficit of 8%. So they have no option but to move to IMF to EGF. Basically, I can't remember the term, but they moved to IMF for the grant, and IMF provided the grant with some conditionality. And one con- and main point of that, those conditionalities were the that India should maintain low fiscal deficit in return for the funds. So so the ministers at those point promised IMF that, and they got the money and they started running the business. And in 2002, FRBM Act, in 2002, FRBM Act was bought, was conceived, basically perceived in 2002. It was passed in 26th of August 2003, and it got affected in 2004, June 2004, from the financial year 2004. And since that, India's governments, subsequent governments, have been trying to maintain strict physical discipline, and they have been at large been success in doing that. Basically, IMF's conditionalities proved later to be good for India in when the at the time of the grant of the conditionalities. And opposition tried to tell the people that sovereignty of the India is basically, if you borrow externally, and if you borrow externally in a large amount, then sovereign decision can't be sovereign anymore, and external powers got a say in your internal business. So the political party tried to draw the narrative that sovereignty of India could get into jeopardy, and that didn't happen. After a point, the conditionality those were put in front of the India, but later proven good for the economy at large, microeconomy at large. And later we reaped the profits in when a large sector of the lower middle class got promoted to a upper income middle class, and a huge upper middle income class got created. And we saw a period of huge GDP growth of 10% in 2001 2000 onwards, and that was a good time. So that happened because of the IMF conditionalities and reformers at large. So after that, they linked in FRBM Act. They linked they didn't provide a range. They provide a fixed number to maintain the physical deficit around that. They tried to point 0.4, I think point 0.4, they will reduce that fiscal deficit by point 0.4 annually. So that was there in FRBM Act, and later it wasn't feasible for the most part of time, and there were clause as exception for the rules, like calamities and exceptional grounds were there, and provoking those grounds, many governments run the large over the top of the debt, over the top of that point, and they run the fiscal deficit around that, and many at point they got very successful and run fiscal deficit at lower point than that. So that happened too. And after that, in 2000, there was a committee under um, FRBM. So subsequently, state governments also, there was a rule in statute in FRBM Act that subsequently state governments will pass acts like Fiscal Regulation Act. So all the states part the FRA Act, and they have been, because states can't have that kind of run of a hand fiscal policy, because they can't borrow externally and they can borrow internally with the consent of the government. And if they have a strong fiscal standing, then only could they borrow. So they aren't as powerful as central in terms of borrowing, so they didn't run that kind of physical menace. So states were okay in that regard, but center wasn't okay. So many economists believe that stringent FRBM, stringent fiscal discipline, put a cap on the growth, because it doesn't provide you a range. It put a fixed number in front of you, so you try to curtail your expenditure, and many at point governments, to show the fiscal deficit and try to thumb their bag, they don't spend on the necessary goals like education and infrastructure stuff. So these things can get compromised at that level of stringent and tough FRBM. And so in a subsequent amendment, they put a range, not a fixed number, a range. So between that range they can play around, and they can be dynamic in making policy in a range of fiscal deficit, so they can do that. So it has been going like that, and now we are in pandemic, and we our GDP is 23 point down in the negative. And if you are in 2 quarters, if you are in negative 2 quarters continuously, then you are in recession. That is the definition of recession in western world. So by that logic, if India improves by a large, and then still they can reach a -10 or -12 GDP, percentage of GDP, even that would make India a recessive economic, as far as now is concerned. And so that is the reality of today. Before this, in 2016 onwards, in I think 9 state quarters, India's economy wasn't doing well, and it was reducing after that GST demonetization of 2016, and after that GST of 2017. India's economy hasn't improved pre demonetization level, so it hasn't got there at any point of time from that point onwards. So we have to wait and watch. But in economy you can't say anything. The people were saying V-shaped recovery, and people in government and officials like chief economic advisor and finance secretary has been saying India will show V-shaped recovery, but that hasn't been the case yet. And we are in 3 months after the lockdown. Lockdown got abrogated in July, and we are in September, and we still aren't seeing the big, because with the mindset of Indian people of not spending much in the crisis, we are seeing the problems, and we won't be recovering as fast as they were saying. So yeah, people are saying K-shaped recovery, K-shaped recovery. Recently found out K-shaped recovery about K-shaped recovery. In K-shaped recovery, the income equality become very large. IMF in the start of the pandemic has said world will see. Basically, they try to connect it with the trend. Whenever there is a pandemic or crisis in the world, uh, K-shaped recovery is soon. In K-shaped recovery, privileged class or the class who have power or the class educated class, they get richer, and there on the on other end of the spectrum, people affected, directly affected by the crisis, like in this case, people connected with real estate, hospitality, energy, and such a sector will get affected, and their income and subsequently the sector's income will get down. So that is K-shaped recovery. You get the two end of the spectrum going in contrastly opposite of each other. So that is going to happen in next few quarters. If you are talking about economy, you have to talk in terms of quarters and financial years. So, and beyond that, beyond 3 or 4 quarters, nobody could really predict what will happen. So economy is a very dynamic play. Let's see what happens. We hope for the best.